companies are facing challenges in terms of like identifying what the right controls should be. So people talk about fairness all the time, right? But then fairness also has several metrics. Now, in terms of distinctive aspects, I would say the very first thing that comes to my mind is that it is punitive in nature, right? Other regulations that we have in US, Canada, or any other place, right? There's no punitive action as such. So specifically talking about AI law, so it clearly prohibits certain use cases. There are certain use cases which are clearly called out, and then there are actually penalties, right, in terms of a certain percentage of the revenue.
Hello and welcome everyone to the next episode of the A Media House podcast Simulated Reality. Today we have with us Anil Sood, leader at EY. Hi Anil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. How are you, Kashyap?
I'm doing well as well. Thank you so much for making the time. We are going to talk about something that is very close to your heart, and you've been working on it for a while, and probably one of the best experts when it comes to talking about the entire regulatory frameworks and the advancements in that field and what does that implicate for different stakeholders within the industry. To start off with, can you tell me a little bit about why this topic interests you? What is it about regulatory governance frameworks and doing consultancy? Why are you so passionate about this subject?
I think it goes well with my background. So, if I have to recollect my prior background, I spent a number of years as software engineer, almost 6, 7 years, and then post that I work in the banking industry. So, I think AI governance is very interesting because it leverages my banking experience. At the same time, it also leverages my technical experience as well, right? So that's why I'm able to contribute very well, and I think that is why I like it a lot.
Fantastic. Given the exponential growth of AI applications, right, we are surrounded with regulatory challenges while enterprises are looking to kind of tap into the resources provided through data. There's always the kind of implications it presents, and technology has always done that. But with the scale at which it can do, especially with artificial intelligence, is very high. How do you perceive the current state of AI governance? Do you think that policymakers are doing enough? Are we advancing in the right direction? What are your initial thoughts on this topic?
Got it. So first of all, I think if you talk about the current state of AI governance, we can clearly see that EU is definitely ahead in the race, right? So there are a number of other regulatory guidelines, but then none of them are as actionable as the EU AI Act. In addition, we have a few more standards. For instance, we have OECD guidelines and we have NIST as well. So, but I think I would say in summary, I mean, so OECD and NIST are anyway not regulatory frameworks. I think those are more of standard setting bodies and more of general guidance. In terms of sovereign states, I would say EUA Act is the closest, and that is the closest something that is enforceable, right? So now AI governance, I would say, is still in transformative stage. I don't think we have reached steady state yet because the guidelines will continue to take their shape, right, as we move forward. We haven't done adequate testing, so I would say we are still not yet in the steady state. So now, in
Please
terms
continue.
of, I think you also spoke about I think the black box problem, right? The explainability and those kind of things. So, I would say EU Act it has set some minimum requirements for explainability. In EU Act, we have three-tier structure, 3 or 4 tier structure. Like for instance, we have prohibited use cases, then we have high risk use cases as well, and low risk use cases as well, right? So all of those segmentation, and it does set some minimum benchmark for explainability. So it is being addressed. However, I think if we go back in time, we'll find that explainability was not that big a concern because prior to I think 2022, we didn't have chat gpt. I mean, it was there, but then it was not really as famous as it is right now, right? So but these days all the regulations are paying a lot of attention to explainability. Now, coming to policymakers, right? So what key challenges they are facing? I would say that the very first challenge they are facing is that law is constantly outpaced by the technology. So drafting and amending the law invariably lags behind AI technological developments. As we can see here, I think EUA Act sort of started 6 years ago, and then the first version I mean, it had, right, is way too different from what it is right now, and clearly because of what we have seen in the form of Gen AI, right? So with the onset of Gen AI systems, EUA Act has also undergone radical changes. Like now, I think the other issue that policymakers are facing is that amendments as well, right? So since it involves a lot of bureaucratic efforts, right? So amendments are not easy to take place. It takes time, the parliament approval, all of those things. So that is why I think I sort of feel that they always lag behind the technological developments. And lastly, I would say, which is again very important issue, is that I think governments and these regulatory bodies don't get a lot of time to sort of pressure test these regulations. They don't do adequate testing. Not trying to say that they don't have experts. They do have experts, but I think the extent of testing is oftentimes not adequate. And I would say in the case of EU Act as well, we haven't done adequate testing. So let's see how it is implemented and what is the response from the masses at large.
Fantastic. Could you elaborate a little bit on the distinctive aspects of the EU AI Act's regulatory framework? Because I think that especially is being considered, Europe has always been ahead when it comes to moving regulatory frameworks or policies or even laws when it comes to that, right? How has it kind of set the base or the context to kind of enable further regulatory frameworks across the globe? And I think especially EU's active involvement in this has been fundamental because a lot of global corporations also are active in the EU, obviously, right? So then it has a lot of, because they have to function in those in that region, they cannot completely ignore it. So what are some of your thoughts on that act, and how has it set context, and what needs to be done more to kind of, for those efforts to kind of seep into the global dialogue of AI frameworks, regulatory frameworks?
Okay, so EU Act, I think, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, right? I think it is definitely at the forefront. It is the closest to what we have in the form of a law, right? I think in a few weeks, or I think in a couple of months, it will take the shape of a law. Now, in terms of distinctive aspects, I would say the very first thing that comes to my mind is that it is punitive in nature, right? So earlier, I mean, the other regulations that we have in US, Canada, or any other place, right? There's no punitive action as such. So specifically talking about AI law, so it clearly prohibits certain use cases. There are certain use cases which are clearly called out, and then there are actually sort of penalties, right, in terms of a certain percentage of the revenue. So first thing is, I think it is punitive. Secondly, there are again stringent obligations around AI systems classified as high risk. So this too is different from global approaches, where the analysis and classification of AI systems and imposition of associated obligations is not this detailed. So I would say it is fairly comprehensive when it comes to the category of high risk systems. And another thing I would say is fairly distinctive is maybe even idiosyncratic, right? Is that in the case of EUA Act, they sort of assume that big means dangerous. For example, any model that uses more than a certain number of flops, I mean, size of the high impact systems, right? So it sort of thinks that okay, it is dangerous, or maybe it could be adverse, right, to public at large. So this may not necessarily be true. Like for example, smarter and more capable doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to cause more harm. So I would say this is also one key aspect that I could recollect from EUA Act. And I think one more important aspect is that EUA Act doesn't really explicitly mandate red team testing. Now, if we recall the executive order from Biden, right, it clearly calls out for, even though it only applies to federal agencies, but then it does sort of emphasize the use of testing, right, in some of these Gen AI applications. But then EUA Act doesn't really explicitly call out, it doesn't really mandate red team testing. So I would say in going forward, it is certainly going to set the tone, because this is, I mean, the EUA Act is going to become the de facto standard going forward because of the scale it's going to operate. It's certainly going to set the tone, and I would say other regulations as well globally can follow a risk-based approach and leverage the key pieces from EUA Act.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what red team testing means exactly, and what does that implicate for enterprises?
So red team testing in general, I would say it's a structured testing effort to find flaws and vulnerabilities of an AI system, right? So it is typically done in a controlled environment and in collaboration with developers of AI. So once we have an AI system in place, we try to figure out use cases which could exploit the weaknesses of the model. So red team testing is nothing but a simple, I mean, again, testing, but then with the intent to identify issues. It could be security issues, it could be privacy issues, or it could be any other kind of issues, transparency and all those things. So the intent here is to ensure, I mean, sort of to identify issues from the Gen AI systems.
Okay. And at what stage do enterprises have to go through this kind of a testing before they when they want to put something in production? Is it also for B2B, or is it all AI areas, and is it only for high risk applications, etc.? So
So generally, red team testing should be done, I think, once the model is ready for deployment, right, or even during the development life cycle. So, and people, I mean, developers would invariably do some sort of unit testing even along the way, right, during the development life cycle of the model. But certainly prior to deployment, we must do red team testing to ensure that there are no ethical, privacy, or security sort of issues in the model. Even post deployment, I think organizations can leverage red team testing to continuously monitor the model. Like when it may happen that, okay, we have done a good first version, but then there could be some issues, right? So red team testing allows us to uncover those issues during the monitoring stage of the AI systems.
yeah, and talking about testing these products, right? Biden administration's plan is to kind of rigorously test new AI products like ChatGPT and share findings with the US official. How do you envision the role of AI testing tools in shaping the regulatory guidance? Furthermore, how can such initiatives effectively mitigate risks associated with AI technologies while promoting innovation and industry collaboration?
Red team testing is always useful. I mean, why not? Because see, when we do testing, right, a lot gets uncovered when we do thorough testing, regardless of the nature of testing, right? So the intent is all good and makes sense. However, I think as for the implementation, this can become a bit of challenge if the application and the specifically around reporting expectations, right, are enforced more broadly. As of now, by the executive order, I think it sort of applies only to federal agencies and not to a large extent to private institutions, right? But then if it is mandated that it should be applied everywhere globally, right, within the US, then it can become, I mean, it can lead to a bit of over governance. So, for example, in the financial services sector as well, right, banks have a lot of regulatory reporting stuff to take care of. And when it comes to AI, the number of players are a lot more, right? And if we mandate such red team testing and regulatory reporting scrutiny, I mean, so what by the executive order says is that once we do the testing, we should also share the results with, I think, the government of the US, right? So that could lead to a bit of over governance, I would say. But I think, having that being said, I would say certainly, I mean, these kind of efforts would uncover issues that could be there in the model, right? And it's certainly going to help the regulatory guidance in coming up with more better and appropriate governance and guidances.
Why do you think historically some institutions, right, especially I'm referring to OECD, have been so proactive when it comes to ensuring regulatory frameworks across technology? So, for example, OECD had made significant contributions in the 1980 guidelines on privacy and transborder data flows, right? Even recently, the EU was also working a lot, even with the GDPR and its notions of where data can reside and should reside, especially if the applications are being built for people in that geography. I think some of these organizations have been pretty active in it. What incentivizes them more to do that, right? Critics at technology policy in the US have always said that we are while the Biden's act on AI was considered a good progress. Many critics in the field also said that there is a lot of ground to be covered yet. So, you know, what is that incentive for these organizations to kind of enable? Is it just, see, I would like to learn more from you before.
So I think OECD, as the name itself says, right, Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development, right? So it's an international organization comprised of 38 member countries. Its mission is to promote policies that would improve the economic and social well-being of people around the world, right? So that's the mandate. And I think not just AI, they also regulate a lot of other things, right, which are in their purview. So it so happens that, okay, AI is one of the key things which we are seeing these days, right? So that is why OECD is looking at AI with a magnifying glass. So now to your question regarding what motivates them, of course, I mean, anything which can adversely impact the economic and social well-being of people, they'll definitely be on a watch, right? They would want to see what's going on with these applications and how it can potentially impact people in an adverse manner.
Does it have the same impact as the federal government of the US or EU passing GDPR, or does it kind of, how do you see the impact on ground because of some of the frameworks that they come? The reason why I ask you this question is because a lot of the times, especially in the times of conflict and some of the other areas, UN's role is questioned many times, right? And because they are a body that kind of surmises a group of countries, but the effect of it is debated over a period of time. I'm not making a statement or asking you to make a statement on whether UN is impactful or not, because that's way broader of a conversation than this
Yeah.
thing. But with regards to the OECD and some of the regulatory frameworks that it comes, how have you seen the impact? Is it seen at the ground level? What does that mean for enterprises? And what are your overall thoughts on the subject?
So OECD, I think its job is not to set the guidelines. I mean, if you think, I think at a very high level, right? What it does is basically it captures the what and the why part. That okay, what needs to be done and why it needs to be done. It won't get into how. That is not OECD's job, right? So OECD will come up with specific guidance that okay, this is what is important. This is what sovereign state should do.
Yeah, that's the very reason of this question. Like,
Yeah.
how much does it impact on ground?
It does have a lot of impact because see, OECD is fairly famous, right? I mean, OECD is pretty much the standard, I would say. Like for example, if you look at the models, AI models definition, right? EU AI Act has borrowed the definition from OECD. So, and then OECD also has a number of working groups that are functioning pretty actively, right? Very frequently. So those AI based working groups, I mean, they do come up with sort of some these guidelines that okay, what next, right? So they're always at the forefront of technological development. So OECD is, I mean, all the government bodies and I mean all the standardizing bodies are definitely having a close watch on OECD. So it does have a lot of impact. But then OECD will not really define what needs to be done. It will only sort of recommend, and then I think it has a big role to play. A lot of countries are looking at OECD for the guidance.
Okay. And with regards to the overall, coming to the Gen AI aspect of it and the kind of data that is needed for building these applications, data intensive applications, there's a lot of guidelines and frameworks that have been defined in the GDPR as well as, the EU AI Act with regards, not EU Act, but especially the GDPR with regards to where data stands, right? Where data should reside. And we just discussed the implications or the importance of it. But with regard, the other aspect of it, and which people are facing a lot, and this is beneficial for enterprises as well, is with regards to the cybersecurity aspect of it, the security of this data, right? Now, one of the biggest advancements in this has been the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? With its voluntary nature and focus on key areas like identification, protection, detection, response, and recovery, how do you envision its impact on bolstering the cybersecurity measures in the context of AI development?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I do understand that it is voluntary in nature, right? So NIST Cyber Security Framework, it is voluntary. However, I think it has become a standard guide for many organizations managing cybersecurity risk. It has, even though it was initially targeted for US, but then it has been adopted outside US too, right? So it is pretty much a standard. And just the way I think we discussed and OECD, right? So similarly, NIST standards. NIST is in the business of doing how, right? We discussed that OECD does what and why, but NIST does how, that okay, how these things should be done. So similarly, in the case of AI as well, NIST has come up with AI risk management framework, I think, which is again being adopted globally, right? So just similar to cybersecurity framework. So I would say, I think to your question regarding how important it is certainly very important. So these management risk management frameworks, be it cybersecurity or AI, right? So they typically support the regulatory mandates, but these don't necessarily inform them, right? So these sort of happen after the fact. These are very important in implementing the regulatory guidelines, but they don't necessarily inform the regulatory guidelines. So when it comes to informing the guidelines, it is OECD. But then when it comes to implementing, people look at NIST.
Yeah. We talked about a lot of initiatives, frameworks, as well as laws, policies, and overall effort towards making AI safe and responsible and building a regulatory framework to ensure the safe and inclusive use of AI, right? It could be
Yeah.
through OECD, it could be the EU AI Act, it could be the Biden Biden's AI Act, it could be the NIST cybersecurity framework. The fundamental question, and this is something that I always wonder, is what will incentivize organizations to effectively build responsible AI, right? The reason why I ask this is because technology has always been an enabler in improving revenues, cutting costs for these enterprises, right? The primary objective of enterprises is to make profit, generate employment, and overall grow as a business. There have been multiple views that I have heard in the past, right? So, for example, one of the leaders that I was speaking with mentioned that good ethics and good responsible AI are good for business, while at the same time, I have heard opposing views saying that good ethics has not always meant good business for many companies across over the years. What are your thoughts on what will enable these enterprises, or what will incentivize these enterprises to take this more seriously and probably not explore into AIs which are high risk, or can have a lot of implications, because we have clearly seen that there are already so many implications of the technology.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think incentive, there are a lot of incentives. So I mean, if we talk about balance sheet, right, for any organization, goodwill is one of the key components. So goodwill is priced in the balance sheet, right? So and goodwill is directly linked to the reputation of the organization, right? So no company would want to take a reputational hit, right? Because when they take a reputational hit, it actually impacts their market cap, it impacts their market value in the market, right? Overall. So I think I would say it is reputational risk primarily, which would make an organization stick to good responsible AI practices. And secondly, I think there are also some regulations. So for example, let's talk about certain use cases in AI, right? So in healthcare, there are a lot of, I think, regulations around healthcare. Similarly in hiring, right? So New York City has I think has a law around use of AI models in case of hiring, and I think it mandates some sort of bias audit. So AI models that we build, right, should not have any bias, even though it talks specifically about demographic parity, but then those are important, right? So it's not just a repetition, it's also meeting certain local laws which require organizations to ensure they follow good responsible AI practices. Now these are the initial sort of thoughts, right? But then even beyond that, I think a lot of, I would say, which I think probably you didn't ask, but then companies are facing challenges in terms of like identifying what the right controls should be. So people talk about fairness all the time, right? But then fairness also has several metrics. What is the right sort of what is the right metric for fairness, right? It could be demographic parity, which New York City has sort of imposed, right? It could also be equalized opportunity. It could also be equalized odds, right? So which metric is right? I think that is something, I think, where regulations are not very prescriptive, right? So companies probably don't really know, okay, what is the right thing to do. So, but otherwise, I would say I think there's a lot of merit in following good responsible AI practices, because it overall, I think, increases the trust in the organization, which directly is linked to the market value of the firm, which sort of adds value to the shareholders. So, yeah, I would say there are enough adequate number of reasons to, I mean, for organizations to ensure good responsible AI practices.
Fair enough. Fantastic. On that note, thank you so much, Anil, for your time. It was a great conversation. Yeah, I'm sure that your views and your insights into some of the latest advances in the regulatory frameworks. It helps organizations and leaders in a lot of ways to kind of navigate within their organizations while they strategize to build AI and applications like generative AI. Thank you so much.
That's good. I think it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this platform.